The valley looked harmless from a distance, just a shallow cut between two ridges, filled to the brim with old snow that had hardened into rippled plates. Under the pale midday sun, everything glared. The slopes, the wind-scoured drifts, even the frost on the patrol's eyelashes. The world was bright enough to hurt, yet muffled like it had been wrapped in cotton. Boots crunched in slow rhythm. A column of tired soldiers moved single file through the trough, shoulders hunched against the wind. Their gi squeaked where straps froze and flexed. Breath came out in short bursts, vanishing fast. Every few steps, someone wiped goggles, smearing the thin film of ice that kept forming along the edges. They were halfway through the valley when the geometry snapped shut. The first round didn't sound like gunfire. They sounded like the air itself tearing. A whip crack overhead, then another, and then the snow beside the lead element punched upward in little geysers. A rifleman at the point staggered, tried to turn, and folded sideways into the drift. His pack hit with a dull thud, and the rest of his body simply stopped moving. A heartbeat of confusion, then the second wave came in full. Long bursts raked down from the ridgelines on both sides, crossing like invisible scissors. The patrol was suddenly trapped in a low trough with nowhere to go. The ridges were too steep for an immediate climb. The valley floor offered only shallow berms and a wrecked utility shed half buried in snow, its corrugated roof bent inward like a crushed can. "Contact! Contact!" someone shouted, but the word didn't matter. Everybody already knew. The air was alive with snapping rounds and the harsh metallic bark of return fire. Sergeant First Class Marlowe, platoon sergeant, old enough to have lines carved into his face even when he wasn't grimacing, dropped behind a frozen berm and yanked his handset up. "Sunray, this is Red 2. Taking fire, grid." Static swallowed him. He tried again, voice tightening as he spoke into the dead air. "Sunray, Red 2, we are." Nothing but a thick, grinding hiss. Not the normal kind of interference. This was heavy, deliberate. A blanket thrown over the net. The radio operator twisted knobs with shaking gloves, swapped to a backup, tried to push higher power. The hiss only got louder, like the valley itself was answering. "Jammed," the operator shouted. "We're jammed." Hence signal started, then failed. Wind kicked ground snow into swirling sheets, and the soldiers couldn't see each other's fingers through the glare and the whipping white. A medic crawled toward the fallen point man, moving low, elbows digging into crust. He got 3 meters before a round snapped into the snow in front of his face and another cracked over his back. Precision fire, not random spray. Someone was walking shots onto him. "Back! Back!" Marlowe barked. The medic tried to pull himself backward, but a third round slammed into the snow beside his shoulder. He flinched hard enough to lose his grip and slid, boots scrabbling, until 2 riflemen hooked him by his vest and hauled him behind the berm. The point man lay out there, alone, a dark shape against the bright drift. Another rifleman tried to run for him. 2 steps, and he went down hard, hit in the thigh. He screamed and rolled, leaving a red streak across the snow that looked obscene against all that white. Marlowe forced himself up just enough to see. The ridgelines above were jagged with rock seams and wind-polished shelves. Perfect firing positions. Perfect concealment. The patrol was in a trough, and the enemy had the high ground on both sides. Whoever planned this had understood the valley like a blueprint. "Smoke!" someone yelled. A grenade popped and spat gray that immediately got shredded by wind. The smoke didn't billow. It tore apart, becoming thin ribbons that did almost nothing. Ammo started disappearing fast. Mags clacking, bolts cycling, hands slapping fresh magazines into wells with numb fingers. Soldiers fired at shadows, at rock, at any flicker of movement. The echo of their rifles bounced off the valley walls and came back wrong, distorted. Marlowe heard a new sound, a deep thump, distant but heavy. Not a rifle. Something bigger being positioned. His mouth dried. He did the math the way seasoned fighters always did. Instinctive, quick. Pinned, jammed, open to both ridges. Wounded stacking up, smoke failing, ammo draining. He looked along the line, finding faces behind goggles, fear and grit mixed together. Then he did something he hated. He admitted he was out of options. "Any snipers here?" he shouted. Not as a rally speech, not as a joke, as a last tool he could reach for. For a moment, only gunfire answered him. Then a figure near the back shifted. She'd been there all morning, quiet, hood up, moving with the column, always a little apart without making it obvious. Paperwork had called her an attached observer or analyst. Most of the patrol had treated her like a passenger with a heavy pack. She didn't shout back. She didn't even look up at Marlowe. She simply rolled her pack sideways and unbuckled a strap. A long, broken-down rifle case slid into view. Matte, scuffed, the kind of case you didn't notice if you weren't expecting it. Somebody near her stared as if seeing it for the first time and realizing they'd walked beside it for hours. Her hands moved with calm speed, fingers sure even through gloves. She snapped the rifle together like it was muscle memory. Upper receiver. Stuck. Bolt. Bipod. Everything locked in with soft clicks that somehow cut through the chaos. She unfolded a small card taped inside her glove. Scribbles, lines, numbers, wind holds. She didn't talk, but her breathing was slow and controlled, like she was somewhere quiet instead of under ridge-wide ambush. The unit around her was unraveling, shouting, gunfire, pain, but she was a pocket of stillness. She planted the bipod into crusted snow and leaned in. One look at the ridgeline. Then her gaze slid to a rock seam no one else was watching. A faint glint. A tiny, unnatural shift. Just a fraction, like something living trying not to be seen. She settled the reticle without hurry. One shot. Not loud. A suppressed crack swallowed by wind. Almost polite. Far above, a silhouette that had been wedged into shadow snapped backward and disappeared behind rock. For half a second the incoming fire faltered, as if the enemy had blinked. Marlowe felt it in his bones. This wasn't luck. This was surgical. He turned toward her, and for the first time he really looked at the quiet attachment in their line. Before he could say anything, the ridges erupted again. Harder now, angrier, bullets chewing into snow and rock as the enemy adjusted. And the question hung in the air, sharp as the cold. Who was she? And how had she seen what nobody else could? That morning had started the way so many did in the mountains, cold enough to make everything feel brittle, routine enough to lull people into thinking the day would stay predictable. They'd packed into a staging hut at first light, shoulders rubbing in the cramped space. A small heater hissed in the corner, coughing more than warming. Condensation froze along the inside of the window frames. Every time the door opened, the cold knifed in like it wanted to take someone. A lieutenant stood over a map taped to a table, gloved finger tracing a route that looked simple on paper, out through a valley corridor, up to a remote sensor relay, confirm integrity, drop a resupply cache, in return for extraction during a narrow weather break. Routine check, he'd said, voice trying to sound casual. We're confirming the relay hasn't been drifted over and swapping out the resupply can. In and out. Marlowe had watched the faces around him. Tired eyes. Chapped lips. Soldiers who'd been running patrols back-to-back because the area was stretching them thin. Short-handed was an understatement. Ammo allocations had been conservative. Weather had slowed resupply. No one had enough of anything except fatigue. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Kellen, had been competent and tight-jawed, the kind of man who carried stress like a second rucksack. He'd asked the right questions about extraction windows and contingencies and gotten the same answers everybody got lately. We'll do what we can. The radio operator, young, eager, carrying extra batteries that rattled in his pouch, had tried to crack jokes until he saw Marlowe's expression. Then he'd gone quiet. The medic, Specialist Dyer, had smiled the way medics often did, like humor was a bandage he could put over the day before it got ugly. He'd checked his kit twice, then a third time when he thought nobody was watching. And then there was the attached specialist. She'd been introduced with paperwork, not ceremony. Corporal Rook, the lieutenant had said, reading from the sheet. Attached for site verification. Observer support. A few heads had turned. Then most had turned away. An observer sounded like someone who took notes, not someone who changed outcomes. Rook had stood near the wall with her hood up, face pale against the dark fabric, eyes scanning the room without seeming to focus on anyone. She didn't talk unless spoken to, and when she did, her answers were short, clean, and empty of personality. One rifleman had muttered something about extra baggage as he adjusted his own load. Another had complained that her pack looked too heavy to be full of sensors and notebooks. Rook hadn't reacted. She'd simply tightened a strap, checked a buckle, and waited. Outside, the world was bright with snow. Daylight flooded everything, flattening shadows, making distance hard to judge. The route on paper had said ridge travel was safer, but the snow had piled deep on the high ground, waist-deep in places, unstable in others. A safer route that you couldn't move through wasn't safer at all. So they'd taken the valley corridor. Time mattered. Extraction had been scheduled for a small window when the wind was expected to calm enough for a bird to land. Miss it and they'd be stuck overnight, exposed, without the luxury of a clean resupply. As they stepped off, Rook had done small things that nobody called out, because in a unit full of people trying to look tough, you didn't usually point out the quiet, careful habits. She'd held up a strip of cloth for a second, watching it flick in the wind. She'd scanned the ridge lines longer than everyone else, eyes slow, patient. She'd marked something on a folded map, one quick pen stroke, then slid it back into a pouch like it didn't matter. The patrol moved through the valley as the sun climbed. Snow sparkled. The air was crisp enough to taste. For a while, it felt almost peaceful, just boots and breath and the faint squeak of gear. Then the first warning sign appeared, tracks that didn't match local herders. Not animal, not the messy, meandering prints of someone wandering. These were deliberate, spaced, straight, cautious. Kellen noticed. Marlowe noticed. They exchanged a glance, the kind that said, "Keep it in your pocket. Don't spook the line." Later they found the dead drone. It looked like a bird at first, half buried in snow, wings splayed. Up close it was a cheap quad frame with a plastic shell shaped to look like a dark feathered crow. Civilian looking. Off the shelf. The kind of thing that belonged in a hobby shop, not in a kill zone. The radio operator crouched beside it and frowned. "I've been getting static off and on," he said. "Like, not normal." Marlowe keyed his handset for a check. It went through, thin but readable. No full jamming yet. Just interference. Like someone testing. He requested Overwatch. A drone. Anything. Hire responded with the usual, weather constraints, competing priorities, limited assets. A polite refusal wrapped in operational language. Protocol met reality and bounced off. At the relay site, they found what the briefing hadn't mentioned. The sensor relay sat on a wind-scoured knob with cables running down into a buried housing. It looked intact from a distance. Closer, the details were wrong. One panel screwed back on at a slightly different angle, cable ties replaced with a cheaper type, a faint scuff line where something had been opened recently and closed again. Inside, a data module was missing. Someone had taken it and tried to make it look like maintenance. Kellen cursed under his breath. Dyer's smile vanished. The radio operator stared as if he'd been slapped. Rook stepped close and went very still. Her eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in confirmation. She reached down, pinched something tiny between her fingers, a shaved piece of cut wire, or a shard of casing, something that didn't belong, and slipped it into a pocket without announcing it. Marlowe noticed. He filed it away. The kind of behavior you only saw from people who understood evidence, patterns, consequences. On the move out, Rook didn't take the comfortable position in the middle like a passenger. She drifted to a place where she could see the most terrain, slightly off the main line, always with sight lines up and out. Still, she remained socially invisible. The others talked around her, joked around her, planned around her, as if she was a piece of gear they didn't have to understand. The daylight stayed bright. The valley stayed quiet. Right up until it didn't. When contact hit, it hit with the kind of timing that made seasoned fighters feel cold in places the weather couldn't reach. The first shots went for the radio operator and the leaders. It was classic, blind them, then cut the head off. The radio operator jerked as his pack took a hit, battery pouch popping open as if punched. He went down hard, scrambling behind a berm, hands clawing at his handset like it was a lifeline. Kellen ducked, shouted, tried to move to rally a flank, and a round snapped inches above his helmet, forcing him flat. Comms died completely. Not just the main net. The backup line of sight set too. Every frequency turned to grinding static the second they tried to push out. This wasn't distant interference. This was close. Mobile. Intentional. The valley became a funnel. Enemy fire stitched from both ridges, intersecting in the trough where the patrol was trapped. Every time someone tried to move, a burst raked the exact line they chose, as if the enemy had already decided where they were allowed to crawl. Wind gusts kicked ground snow into the air, turning visibility into a moving curtain. Muzzle flashes were hard to spot in daylight glare. Sound bounced strangely, making it difficult to tell which ridge held the heavier guns. Soldiers burned ammo fast, because that's what fear does when it's cold and bright and you can't see the shooter. Mags emptied, barrels heated. Steam rose from ejection ports and froze in the air like ghost breath. A second casualty stacked on the first, point man already down. Now a rifleman hit in the thigh. He screamed until he bit his own glove and turned the scream into a shuddering moan. Dyer crawled, eyes hard, trying to reach him, but precision rounds bracketed the path. One into the snow left of Dyer's elbow. One into the snow right of his shoulder. The enemy wasn't trying to kill the medic immediately. They were controlling him, pushing him where they wanted. Marlowe tasted copper in his mouth. Not blood. Stress. Time pressure tightened like a vice. If they missed extraction, the valley would become their grave. Night in these mountains wasn't just darkness. It was cold that stole motive function, weather that erased trails, wind that made aircraft a gamble. Overnight meant encirclement. It meant being hunted at leisure. And then Marlowe saw something that confirmed what his gut already knew. The enemy wasn't rushing to wipe them out. They were shaping. The fire pattern pushed the patrol deeper into the trough, toward a specific bend where the valley narrowed and rose. Every attempt to climb one ridge got punished harder than attempts to move forward. Every attempt to retreat got met with bursts that forced them back down. It was rehearsed. Marlowe tried smoke again. Wind shredded it. He tried bounding. The moment two soldiers moved, pre-aimed lanes snapped into them and drove them flat. Protocol was being answered by preparation. Rook stayed low near the wrecked shed, listening. Not just to gunfire, but to cadence. To the pauses between shots. To the way certain rounds arrived in pairs. To the drift of disturbed snow that marked where bullets struck. She was reading the fight like it was written in the air. She opened her pack again, assembled the rifle fully, and settled behind it as if the world had narrowed down to one clean problem. Her eyes flicked up. A rock outcrop on the left ridge. A place where the enemy's fire seemed to talk to the others. Short bursts, then adjustments, then the heavier weapons shifting. A spotter. An observer. Someone calling corrections. Rook waited until the gust eased and the snow curtain thinned. One shot. The suppressed crack barely registered. The outcrop's shadow moved, then collapsed like someone had unplugged it. Incoming fire stuttered. Not stopped, but confused for a fraction. Long enough for Marlowe to bark. Move the wounded. Behind the shed. Ammo count now. The patrol gained a sliver of breathing room. Soldiers dragged the point man by his webbing, boots sliding on packed snow. Dyer pressed gauze to the thigh wound, face inches from the man's pale skin, working fast. Marlowe leaned toward Rook. How many shots you got? Rook didn't look away from her scope. Enough if I don't waste them, she said, voice quiet and flat. A new sound rolled down the valley, the hollow clunk of a tube being set. Then a low shout in a language Marlowe didn't know. Rook's gaze shifted. On the right ridge, three shapes moved with purpose, one carrying a long tube, the other two hunched low. RPG team. They weren't firing yet. They were positioning to collapse the shed, their only cover. Marlowe's stomach tightened. They're going to crack us open. Rook's answer wasn't reassurance. It was a calm, almost clinical observation. They're pushing us toward the bend, she said. They want us alive, long enough to get there. And that was worse than being killed outright. Suppression wouldn't win. Marlowe knew it, Kellen knew it, and every soldier who'd fought in mountains knew it. You don't beat high ground by yelling louder. You beat it by taking it, or by cutting the pieces that make it lethal. They needed the jammer down. They needed the ridgeline broken. They needed an angle the enemy hadn't rehearsed. Marlowe's eyes tracked the ridges, sheer in most places, with a few cut lines where wind had exposed rock. There was one faint switchback, a goat trail maybe, half-buried, blending into the slope like a scar. Rook saw it too. For the first time all day, she looked directly at Marlowe and spoke more than a handful of words. "Trail," she said, pointing with 2 fingers. "Up. Offline. I can get a notch." Marlowe stayed at the line she indicated. It looked impossible. Ice under powder, exposed rock shelves, no cover. A climb that would chew hands raw through gloves. Alone, he asked, because the question was automatic, not because he expected comfort. Rook gave a small nod. No drama, no ego, just a decision. "From there," she continued, "I can see their nodes. Jammer, lead, heavy team. But I need space. I need you to hold." Protocol screamed against it. Splitting forces under fire was how people got isolated and killed. Sending one person alone into that ridge was how you ended up writing a letter home. But the alternative was already unfolding. Everyone dying in a trough while the enemy herded them into the bend. Marlowe made the decision the way leaders in bad fights always did, choosing between ugly options. "Go," he said. Rook didn't nod again. She just moved. She stripped weight with fast efficiency. Extra gear out. Only essentials kept. Rifle. A few magazines. A compact range card. Minimal medical. And something else. A small, hard case tucked deep in her kit, handled with a protective reflex. For a second, Marlowe caught the edge of it. Sealed, labeled, the kind of thing you didn't want to lose. Then she buried it again and cinched her pack. A gust ripped through the valley, lifting snow off the berms in a sudden white sheet. Rook used it like a curtain. She slipped away from the line, a shadow moving into the storm. For a moment her silhouette blurred, then vanished completely into the blowing white. Below, the patrol fought to survive with what they had left. Kellen organized controlled bursts, forcing discipline into hands that wanted to shake. Dyer worked on the wounded, pressing bandages into blood that wanted to freeze. The radio operator kept trying, different frequencies, different power, static swallowing every attempt. Marlowe watched the ridges and listened for the enemy's next move. He could feel them adjusting, searching for whatever had disrupted their rhythm. Up on the slope, Rook climbed. It was brutal. Ice hit under powder, turning each step into a gamble. Her gloves slipped on rock polished by wind. Metal edges bit through fabric. Cold tried to steal sensation from fingers and toes, making every grip feel uncertain. She anchored herself with a strap looped around a rock spur, moved 3 points at a time, slow and sure. When she had to cross an exposed section, she waited for another gust to throw snow into the air and obscure her outline. Halfway up, she paused, chest tight, and looked down. The patrol in the trough looked small, dark dots in a bright wound of snow. Gunfire seemed almost distant from that height, as if the valley was trying to swallow the sound. She pushed on. At the top third, the slope narrowed into a shelf behind a boulder line, a place you wouldn't see from below because it sat off the obvious ridgeline. Not on the crest, not on the main rock seam. Offline, hidden by the geometry of the mountain itself. An impossible angle. Rook crawled onto the shelf, packed snow into a shallow lip, and built a microhide using rock and drift, enough to break her outline, enough to keep glare off her lens. Then she scanned. The enemy structure revealed itself in layers. Near a portable mast, half concealed in a hollow, a jammer operator crouched over equipment, antenna, cables, battery boxes. Not far from him, a team leader moved between positions with a purposeful economy, gesturing, controlling. On the right, an RPG element shifted toward the valley bend, using a small civilian hater shack as a landmark and maybe as cover. The moral constraint hit hard. If that shack was occupied, if a family had taken shelter there, if a hater had ducked inside to escape the wind, then any shot around it could cost the wrong lives. Rook's optic flickered, battery low, illumination unreliable in the glare. She adjusted, knowing she'd have to rely on natural light and clean holds. She exhaled, slow and measured, and set her rifle into the snow. Below, the patrol held with dwindling ammo and rising desperation. Above, alone on a shelf the enemy hadn't planned for, Rook prepared to dismantle a trap one critical piece at a time. Rook didn't shoot like someone chasing revenge. She shot like someone solving a problem. Force multipliers first. Anything that shaped the battlefield. Anything that made the enemy's plan possible. Her reticle settled on the jammer operator. He was hunched over a control box, gloved hands moving between switches and cables. A portable mast rose beside him, thin and ugly against the snow. Rook waited. Not for courage, she had that, but for a clean background, for a moment when the operator shifted away from the hollow's edge and she could be certain what sat behind him. He leaned in, adjusting something. Rook pressed. One suppressed crack. The operator's body jerked and sagged forward, hands slipping off the box. He tried to push up, failed, and rolled sideways into the snow. The mast stood, but the human controlling it was gone. Down in the valley, the radio operator's handset popped with sudden clarity, partial, thin, but real. Red 2, say again. Marlowe snatched the handset. Sunray, Red 2, we are in contact, jamming reduced, request immediate extraction. Window closing. Static chewed at the edges, but the message got out. A reply came back broken but unmistakable. Extraction was possible. Minutes, not hours. Time pressure sharpened into a blade. Rook didn't celebrate. She slid her reticle to the next piece. A replacement spotter had shifted into the dead observer's role. A figure using binoculars, body language tight, relaying corrections with hand signals down the ridge. Without spotters, precision fire becomes guesswork. Rook tracked the man's breathing, the sway of his weight, and waited until his binoculars caught the sun. One shot. The binoculars dropped into the snow. The figure followed. On the ridges, enemy fire changed. Less precise, more volume, more frustration. The kill geometry started to blur. Next, the RPG threat. The team lead stepped into view near the civilian shack line, raising a hand, pointing, controlling where the tube would aim. If she hit him too close to the structure, she risked rounds flying wild into the wrong place. Rook waited until he took 2 steps away, into open snow with nothing behind him but rock and drift. One shot. He fell hard, and the RPG gunner froze, suddenly without direction, suddenly unsure. Down below, Kellen saw it. He didn't waste the opening. Bound left. Smoke on my mark, he shouted, voice snapping discipline into exhausted bodies. Ammo check, share now. Soldiers redistributed magazines with quick, cold hands. Dyer and 2 riflemen dragged the wounded onto a torp, cinching straps so they could pull him without losing grip. Smoke grenades popped again, still shredded by wind, but now timed with movement, not hope. The patrol began to inch out of the worst lanes. That's when the enemy adapted. They weren't amateurs. Their plan had been built on control, and someone was taking their control away. They felt it. They reacted with the sharpness of people who'd fought before. A counter-sniper pair shifted along the ridge, moving like ghosts between rock seams. A flanking element began climbing toward Rook's shelf, using the same wind gusts she'd used, mirroring her improvisation with their own. And then came the drone. A small quadcopter lifted low over the ridge line, plastic body dark against the snow, its rotors buzzing like an angry insect. It moved in short, deliberate sweeps, searching for heat and movement, trying to find the source of the precision shots. Rook didn't panic. She froze. She became rock. The drone passed near her shelf, close enough that she could see ice clinging to its frame. It hovered, then drifted away, unable to confirm what it suspected. Rook let it go. Then she shifted 2 meters, slow, careful, into a secondary microhide she'd already prepared, because people like her didn't rely on one plan. Her optic fogged as she moved, snow packed into the lens edge. She wiped with a glove, and ice smeared across the glass, blurring clarity into a hazy halo. Equipment failure. Temporary, but cruel. She forced herself to accept the imperfect sight picture and work through it. Fear rose, tight in the chest, quick in the throat, but function stayed on top. Always the work first. She found the enemy's field commander, not by rank insignia, too far, too obscured, but by behavior. He moved between positions with intent, pointed, corrected, rallied. He leaned into a radio handset, speaking fast, trying to regain coordination now that jamming had weakened. Taking him would be escalation. It would announce that the precision threat wasn't luck. It was a professional. Leaving him alive would keep the trap alive. Rook waited for the moment when his head and chest aligned cleanly and the background was safe. He leaned into the handset again, gesturing toward the valley bend, still trying to herd the patrol toward whatever waited there. Rook pressed. One shot. The commander's gesture cut off mid-motion. The handset dropped. The man collapsed as if his strings had been cut. On the ridges, enemy fire lost rhythm immediately. Bursts became uneven. Movement became hesitant. The enemy didn't stop fighting, but their cohesion cracked like ice under weight. That was the turning point, and it made Rook a priority. The counter-snipers opened on her rock line. Rounds chipped stone, sending splinters and dust into her face. A near miss slammed into the boulder lip, showering her hide with grit. Rook tucked in tight, heart hammering now, but hands steady. She had a choice: break contact and save herself, or stay long enough to cover the patrol's extraction move. She chose the patrol, because that's what quiet professionals did. They carried the cost so others didn't have to. Down below, smoke bloomed again, thicker now as multiple grenades went at once. Soldiers pulled the torp, boots slipping, bodies leaning into the drag. Kellen pushed the line forward, using the enemy's momentary confusion to gain ground. But the enemy tried one last clamp. A crew-served weapon team, something heavier, began setting up to bracket the valley exit. If they got it oriented, the patrol would be pinned again with no time left. Rook found the gunner's leader by posture and urgency, the way he slapped a teammate's shoulder, the way he pointed at the trough's mouth. Her sight picture was still smeared. She compensated, holding center mass, trusting her own consistency more than the glass. One shot. The leader crumpled. The crew-served setup stalled. Hands hesitated. A man ducked instead of stepping into position. That was all the opening Kellen needed. Now, he shouted. Move! 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 The patrol punched out of the trough, smoke shredding behind them, dragging wounded, firing controlled bursts to keep heads down. They didn't run like a stampede. They moved like a unit that had been given a narrow door and understood it might close. Rook took her riskiest shots during their withdrawal, short windows, tight holds, suppressing the counter-snipers long enough to prevent clean hits on the men in the open. Then she broke contact. She slid down the back side of her shelf, using snow like a chute, rifle hugged close, body angled to control speed. Behind her, rounds snapped into the rocks where she'd been seconds before. The flanking element arrived at her hide to find only disturbed snow and silence. The enemy had adapted. So had she. And down in the valley, the unit moved, alive, because the quiet attachment had turned the battlefield into a sequence of solvable problems. Extraction came in battered daylight. The helicopter's shape appeared through blowing snow like a dark rumor, then grew real as it flared over the landing zone, rotor wash turning the snow into a spinning halo. The world became noise and white churn. Marlowe counted heads with shaking hands, loading wounded first, hauling men up by straps and arms. Dyer climbed in backward, still pressing gauze, still working, because medics didn't stop just because an aircraft arrived. Kellen shoved the last rifleman aboard, then turned, scanning the ridge line with a look that was half fury, half disbelief. Rook appeared last. I streaked her hood. A thin line of blood ran from a cut near her cheek where rock chips had found skin. She moved like she'd walked out of ordinary weather, not out of a counter-hunt. She climbed aboard without ceremony, rifle case strapped tight across her chest. Inside, the cabin smelled like sweat, cold fabric, and iron. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Not because they didn't have words, but because words felt too small. Back at the outpost, The debrief was clinical at first: maps, grids, casualty counts, ammo expenditure. Command personnel listened with widening eyes as Marlowe described comms failure, the deliberate shaping fire, the jammer, the herd toward the bend. Then he said what mattered most. One attached specialist reversed the engagement. He reported flatly. Someone asked what kind of observer carried a precision rifle and knew how to dismantle an ambush like she'd built it. The answer came in pieces. The missing data module wasn't just equipment. It held relay logs, proof the sensor network had been compromised, proof that someone had been mapping patrol responses and timing extraction windows. The enemy's motive wasn't simply to kill a patrol. It was to blind the region's early warning chain and score a propaganda victory by capturing either the proof or the person who could authenticate it. That was why the ambush felt too prepared. They had mapped the valley, planted observers, timed the jamming to isolate the unit, positioned heavy teams to control movement. They expected the patrol to come because tampering with the relay guaranteed a response. And that was why Haya had sounded too busy. The enemy had shaped the environment, weather, interference, false signals, making support harder to allocate until it was nearly too late. Rook's small hard case, the one she guarded, held an encrypted copy of the critical data. A contingency, proof that couldn't be erased by stealing one module. She wasn't a desk analyst. She was the kind of operator who got attached quietly, because quiet reduced leaks, because visibility made people targets, because sometimes the safest weapon was the one nobody noticed until it fired. As for what she'd noticed on the ridge, it hadn't been luck. It was pattern recognition, an optic glint that didn't match snow glare, a drift-shaped disturb in a way wind wouldn't do, the tiny movement of a shooter trying to reset after recoil. After the debrief, while others got bandaged and rearmed and swallowed hot drinks with trembling hands, Rook sat alone on a bench in a maintenance bay, cleaning her rifle. Her movements were still precise, but now her fingers shook, subtle, delayed. Fear arriving late, when function no longer needed to dominate. Marlowe approached quietly and stopped a few steps away, as if respecting an invisible perimeter. He didn't offer praise. He didn't try to make a speech out of her. He simply said, "You saved them." Rook didn't look up right away. When she did, her eyes were steady, but tired. "I did the work," she answered. Outside, the sun still hammered the snow with harsh brightness. Wind still dragged ice crystals across the ground like sand. In that bright white world, her footprints were the only ones leading up toward the ridge line, one thin trail cutting through the glare. Proof that the quietest person had carried the loudest moment.